Hello and welcome back. If you made it through part 1, congratulations. In that part we covered the less exciting but nevertheless important issues for setting up your hardware and software to produce that perfect print. In this part 2 we're going to go through the ultimate workflow to produce excellent prints every time. I've been printing for over 20 years, and during that time I've learned from some of the experts in the field, and I've put that knowledge into practice in this workflow that you're going to have a look at today. And there are 5 things that we need to step through. Firstly, the elephant in the room is soft proofing. We'll discuss that a little bit further. Secondly, we'll be talking about sizing and setting the DPI for our print for the output, making adjustments for the type of paper we're going to use, applying the appropriate output sharpening, which is a critical part of the step, and then setting up our printer and paper settings to produce that perfect print. So we'll get started with looking at soft proofing first. The first thing we're going to have a look at is the question of soft proofing. Now there's a lot of argument and debate about the merits of soft proofing, but let me just cut to the chase. The simple answer is soft proofing will give you an idea of how your image will look when printed, but it can't simulate the paper surface or the paper texture. So at best it's a guide, not a definitive answer. So looking at Photoshop, let's see how we can evaluate using the soft proofing built into Photoshop. Now there's 2 ways we can do this, the easy way and the hard way. The hard way is we go into View, Proof Setup, Custom, and then using the menu that pops up we choose the profile that we're going to use for this image, and in this case I am going to use a custom profile that is for the Canson RAG photographic. And if we select that profile, tick the simulate paper color and turn the preview on and off, you're unlikely to see on this video any difference. It's very, very slight, the difference between the two, and that's the tricky way to do it. The simpler way to do this is to simply just go to the File, Print menu, and with the menu box that opens up, let's have a look here. We make sure that Photoshop handles the colors. We can then look at the Canson, this is the custom profile, and again looking at relative colorimetric, rendering intent, and if we tick and untick this box here, you'll see there's virtually no difference. Now if we go back and look at the standard profile provided by Canson for this paper, which is for the Epson P800, with a lot of profiles loaded, it's very hard to locate them sometimes. But now we look at the standard profile and you can see that there is a difference. If we turn the gamut warning on and off, you'll see that there is some issues with that. And that's because a custom profile will always give you a better result than a standard profile. If I just cancel out of that and we look at another image where we can see this a little more distinctly, this is an image of some rotting kelp taken on the west coast of Tasmania. If we do the same thing, go into our print preview window, and using the same printing profile, let's just get this set up the right way. The Canson profile, you'll see here that there are some gamuts of the image that can't be printed, particularly in the deeper shadow areas. You'll see this gamut warning turned on. You'll see that's an issue, and if we were then to go and select the custom profile that I have for this, you'll see now that the image is within gamut. So a custom profile can give you a better result, but it will cost money, and you'll need someone to make that for you. These have been made by the fabulous Dr. Les Walkling, who is Australia's, if not the world's, leading expert on digital printing. And so if you really want to go to the ultimate level, you might want to consider a custom profile. But the short answer here is that a soft proofing output will give you an idea, not a definitive answer. So let's look at what happens in Lightroom if you're going to print from Lightroom. We can do the same thing here. We can go to the Develop module, and we can turn on the soft proofing option. It will change the background to white to simulate paper. And then again, if we look at the custom profile I have here, and to simulate paper and ink, you may or may not see any difference whatsoever on this, and that's the same, giving you basically the same result. So that's soft proofing. It will give you an idea, not a definitive answer to how your print will look on paper. Okay, the second thing we need to look at is setting the image size and the DPI for the printer. But before we go there, let's just remind ourselves that when we're looking at preparing our image for print, we need to be working with our printing profile on our monitor so that we can accurately see how the image is going to look. So if you have an ISO monitor or something similar, you can set the profile up and make sure that you swap to that before you start doing this process. Or if you're using another type of monitor, you will need to use some sort of third-party profiling software. But we've already done that, so let's just pop back, and we'll look at printing from Lightroom a little later, because the preferred method here is to print using Photoshop. Now, some people will argue you can get a good result from printing within Lightroom, and yes, you can, but if you want to have the ultimate control over the output, there are things that we can do in Photoshop that you don't have access to in Lightroom. So we've already done some soft proofing with our image. The next thing we're going to need to do is to set the size of the image that we want the printed to, and then also set the DPI, because when we send the image to the printer's a dumb device. It doesn't know how it's going to resample the image, so we need to do that first. And the way we do that firstly is this image currently has all of the adjustments to the base image contained within a group. What we would normally do would be to go to the layers menu, flatten the image, and combine all of those adjustments into one image. And what we're going to do is we're not going to save this image after this, unless you want to particularly save this again for printing, in which case you would save it as a different version of the file. So having flattened the image, the next thing we want to do is we want to go and determine the output size before we send it to the printer. And we go to the image menu, image size, and we can then set the image size. Now at the moment it's set to pixels. For people in the Western world, we set it to millimeters, and for the people in America, you may want to use inches. But the important thing here is to do some resampling of the image to get the image size and the resolution to what the printer demands. And as I mentioned before in part 1, if you're printing on an Epson printer, you want to set it to 360 pixels per inch, because that's the native resolution of the printer. If you send it more or less than that, the printer is going to either interpolate the missing pixels or delete pixels accordingly, and you have no control over that. So the best way to do that is to set our printer resolution here, and then we will set our print size. Now if we were going to print on an A2 size paper, we would probably print to something like 560 millimeters, because we need a little bit of a border on our print, and we will see that the image will be needed to be a little bit interpolated, and we do that here using the resampling method. Now if you're enlarging the image for printing, which is unlikely with modern high-resolution cameras, you're most likely going to be slightly reducing the print size, and so you will need to do some resampling here, and Photoshop does a pretty good job of doing the resampling, and you will get the best results doing it this way. But here we're going to print onto A3, and typically we might print at 360 millimeters by 240 for a 3x2 image. But the important things, regardless of what size you're going to print to, you need the resolution set at 360. We're now going to resample that image, and it is now at the size we want for printing. Now that we have our image at the correct size and pixels per inch to send to the printer, the next thing we need to do is to apply some output sharpening. Now in the process of squirting ink onto paper, there's a little bit of softening that occurs to our print. So to counteract that, we use some output sharpening. and this is different from the sort of input or creative sharpening you might apply to your image during the processing steps. This is particular to the print process. So if we look at this image, this is quite a sharp image. Zooming into 50%, we can see that we've got a lot of critical sharp areas in this image, and we want to retain that in our print. If your image is a soft image that doesn't require a lot of sharpness, you don't necessarily need to do this because there will be some additional softening applied. But if you're wanting to retain that critical sharpness in your print, we need to do some output sharpening, and we'll do this in 2 stages. Let's just go through that now. Firstly, let's make a duplicate of our background layer, and we will then go into the filters menu, into sharpen, and in this case we're going to use the smart sharpen option, and we're going to do some over sharpening here, but we're going to allow some flexibility in the opacity of this layer to allow for some fine adjustments once you've done a hard proof. So what we would do typically is to apply an amount of 300%, a radius of 0.5 of a pixel, and there's a nominal amount of noise reduction we can apply, and that might vary depending on your image. Tick the box marked lens blur to remove any lens blur that might have occurred. And the critical thing here with the smart sharpen is we can fade the amount of sharpening from the shadows and the highlight areas, and I typically would reduce that by 50% in both the shadows and the highlights, and use a tonal width of 20 in each case. Now, having done that, we go OK. It will apply that smart sharpening to your image, and then once that's done, you can now see that that image looks a little bit over sharpened, and that's okay because that's what we're going to use for the printer. And with that background layer that we've made, let's just call that smart sharpen. And what we're going to do is we're going to blend that to luminosity, because all we want to worry about is the luminosity values that we were adjusting. The sharpening, if you recall, is increasing the contrast at the edges of tonal values. It has no influence on the color, so we're going to blend that back to luminosity and drop the opacity back to somewhere about 70%. So that allows us to, if we find after we've done our first print we want a little more sharpening, we don't have to redo this, we can just go and adjust the opacity. So having done that, the second stage we're going to apply is a high pass filter sharpening, and that gives us a little bit of a boost in the midtones. So with that first layer already applied, let's make another duplicate of the background layer, and we'll drag that up to the top, and we're now going to change this to overlay blend mode, which is going to look horrible. But what we're going to do now is go to the filter, we'll go down to other, and we will look at high pass as the filter. Now typically with this we just want to apply a very small amount of high pass sharpening. A radius of 2 pixels will be enough, and you'll see here this layer now looks weird, but when you turn it off and on you'll see that there's a little bit of a change in the mid-tone area, and again we'll drop that back to somewhere near 70% so that we've got an option then to increase or decrease that once we've done a test print. If we zoom back to our full screen, you'll see that the effect is barely noticeable on the image at full size on screen. You need to zoom into about 50% to see the effect of that. So now we have our image sized, and we now have the output sharpening applied. The next step we're going to do is to make some minor adjustments to suit the type of paper. So the next thing we need to look at is we need to look at whether we need to make some fine adjustments to our print to suit the type of paper we're going to print on. We looked at this earlier in the soft proofing to have a look at printing it on a Canson rag photographic paper which uses a matte black ink, and we know that with the matte black inks and the matte surface papers we lose a little bit of depth in the blacks, and we also lose a little bit of saturation. So we can try and counteract that by making a fine adjustment. If we were going to use a paper that uses the photo black inks, we don't need to do these couple of steps because the paper will handle that perfectly. So let's go back out of that. In this image, we've already worked up this image quite extensively, and we've increased the color saturation and the black contrast already. So let's look at another option, and that is this particular image here. This has already been sized and sharpened, and now we're going to have a look at increasing the depth of the blacks and a little bit of saturation boost just to counteract that softness that we get using the matte surface paper, or the paper that uses the matte inks. So the first thing we want to do is we want to build a bit of extra depth into the blacks, and we do this by simply applying a curves adjustment to the image. And what we do here looks a little bit counterintuitive, but it works. First thing we do is we take the white point end of the curves line and we pull it all the way over to somewhere about the 30% mark. If you don't see these divisions in increments of 10%, if you hold down Alt and click on your image, it will swap between quarters and 10%. What we need to do now is, you'll see that what we've done is we've basically clipped most of the image to white, and what we're going to do is use this curves to just give us a nice gentle roll off in the tonal value, so that we've just targeted the darker tones in the image. And that looks terrible, but what we do now is we change the blend mode to multiply. That's really important. By changing the blend mode to multiply, we're just affecting the darker parts of the image, and you will just see a slight difference when we turn that off and on. The very darkest parts of the image will be a little bit darker. It's not a dramatic change, it's just a subtle improvement. And the second thing we might need to do is to increase the saturation of the image, just to counteract that little bit of loss of vibrancy that we may get with matte papers. And typically we would do that by about 10 to 15%, depending on your image. It may look a little bit oversaturated on screen, and particularly here in these bright orange areas, you may see a little bit of an increase. But that's all we need to do to make those fine adjustments for printing on matte papers, or papers that use the matte black ink set. For papers that use the photo black ink set, we don't need to use either of these two adjustments. Now we're just about in the home stretch. We're almost ready to send our image to the printer, but we now need to set the printer up with those settings that we've already discussed. So the first thing we need to do is we need to go through the print menu in Photoshop. We go to File, Print. If you have an option of a printer, you need to choose which printer you're going to send it to. In this case, it's an Epson P800. And the next thing we do is we open the box that says Print Settings. And here is where we need to set up some critical things to make sure that the printer is going to handle the image correctly. And I've already made presets for most of the papers that I use, but let's have a look at Canson Rag Photographic, which is the one that we've been using in this example, and there are some settings here to have a look at. But how do we set these up? Well, when you've gone and downloaded those profiles from the Canson website, you will have had access to a list of settings. Now, in this case, we're using the paper which is the Rag Photographic 310 GSM, and you'll see here that the setting for an Epson printer is to use the type of paper velvet fine art paper, and it tells us here we're using matte black inks, so we can get rid of that. And so here is where you set this up. We choose the media type, and you've got various options here, and under fine art paper we can see we have velvet fine art paper. That's the setting to tell the printer the type of paper we're printing on, and obviously we're printing in color. Under the print quality, obviously we want to look at the best quality. If we go into quality options, we want the maximum quality. We don't care about speed, and we have all of these options set to the maximum. And here's the critical part. Under the color mode, most important, rather than letting the printer choose how it manages the color, we turn the color management off on the printer, and here down here you'll see that there's a couple of options here where we've chosen the size of paper, and for the Epson printer it wants the paper fed from the front because it's a fine art heavyweight paper. Once you've set all of these things up, you can save those settings and give it a name, and this has already been done, so I'm not going to do that, but we call that Canson Rag Photo A3. We now have told the printer what we're going to send it. And you'll see here that my paper orientation is wrong. That's not a problem. We'll just go back into the print window here and change that to landscape format. And so now we're just about ready to go. We can see our image on the paper. We have a gamut warning, and even with those increases in saturation and contrast, if I turn that gamut warning off and on, you'll see that there's just a very slight little bit of out of gamut here, but nothing to worry about. So the next thing we need to look at is the color management, and this is the most critical part. There's a big warning sign here. Remember to disable the printer's color management. So we've done that already, and we want to tell Photoshop who's managing the colors. Well, Photoshop's going to manage the color, and here's the printer profile we're going to use. We've already chosen that. That's the custom profile for that particular paper. We're normal printing, and for 99% of printing jobs you're going to use relative colorimetric as the rendering intent, and that is how Photoshop translates the colors that are out of gamut. Remember, we were working in a very large ProPhoto RGB color space, and we're now going to send this to a printer which has a smaller color space, and how is it going to translate those colors, and that's the rendering intent. And leave this box ticked for the black point compensation that will try and darken the blacks to suit the type of paper. And looking down this menu item, we can see here that we have set our print size. We're printing at 100%, and it is at the optimum resolution for the printer, 360 pixels per inch for an Epson printer and 300 for a Canon printer. And then if all of that's set up, you're ready to print and load the paper into your printer, and away you go. We've looked at the settings for printing from Photoshop, but what if you really want to print from Lightroom? Let's have a look at how we would do that. Here in Lightroom we've already got our image set up. This is the same image that we've used in the Photoshop example, and we would go across to the print module to set this up. And there are various options for number of images on a page, but let's say we just want to print the one image on one page. We choose this layout, a single image, and we will set our margins, and more importantly set the size of the cell that our image is going to fit into. And in this case it's the same as what we did in Photoshop, 360 by 240. And if we scroll down, we can tell the printer how we want that image resampled. We want it set to 360 pixels per inch. But here's where the difference occurs. We only have an option here of print sharpening, and we have three settings: low, standard or high. So we don't have the option of customizing that output sharpening. Let's just leave that at standard, and you've got a choice of media type, matte or glossy. Matte for matte black, glossy for photo black. That adjusts the type of sharpening that's applied, and so you don't have quite the same control. And over on the left hand side, if we go down to the bottom and choose page setup, we'll see here we have the printer, and again, depending on whether you're a Windows or an Apple user and the type of printer, this menu might vary a little bit, but we would go into the properties for the chosen printer, and again it's accessed the same settings that I've already saved in Photoshop. We choose the paper type, the color, the quality options, and make sure that there's no color adjustment being applied by the printer, and we're ready to print. But as you can see, we don't have quite the same controls. We do have a little option down here for doing a print adjustment, and so what we can do here is fiddle around with the contrast and the brightness, but it's really a little bit hard to see what's happening. But that's the way you print from Lightroom, and you'll get a good result, but you won't get the best result. Once you've completed your first print, you should then compare it with the image on screen and, if necessary, make any further fine adjustments, but it should be very close to what you've seen on screen, bearing in mind that the lighting conditions might affect how your image appears when compared against your screen. And in the next video I will show you how to print using Epson's black and white RIP and produce perfect black and white prints. So thanks for watching, and I look forward to seeing you soon.